Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to welcome you to the Center of Leadership and Ethics and the first of our 3 sessions in the Center's Courageous Leadership Speaker Series for academic year 21-22. Now, the Courageous Leadership Speaker Series brings in a variety of speakers of particular interest to the Corps cadets to engage with the cadets, engage with staff and faculty, engage with those of you in the audience, and provide their personal insights into some things they've done in their experience, and especially as pertains to the field of leadership and ethics. And today's has a lot to deal with leadership, especially in ambiguous, challenging environments. Today's events are going to focus on the opening of the global war on terrorism and America's initial response to the 9/11 attacks. And the gentlemen you're going to hear with today, 3 of them, were among the first of American operators who entered Afghanistan and conducted an unconventional war to begin to take the war to the Taliban and the Al-Qaeda. Now, today's presentation is going to involve a moderated panel, members of the CIA and Special Forces, and the author of the book, First Casualty, who has gathered their story and put it in great context. I highly recommend the book. It's on sale outside, and they'll be around for a book signing after that. So, ladies and gentlemen, please hold your applause until I'm done introducing each of the panelists. Our first panelist is Toby Harden. He is an author, journalist, and winner of the Orwell Prize. His most recent book, First Casualty, The Untold Story of the CIA Mission to Avenge 9/11. He's a former foreign correspondent for the Sunday Times of London and the Daily Telegraph. And he has reported from 33 different countries. He specializes in terrorism and war. He is a dual British and American citizen, and he now lives in Northern Virginia. Our next panelist is Mr. David Tyson, who retired from the CIA's clandestine service in 2020 after a 25-year career. The majority of his service was spent overseas. Most of his deployments and postings were in Central Asia and the Caucasus region, both of recent interest to us here in the United States, and in South Asia, where he was chief of station twice. He led and took part in paramilitary and counterterrorist operations in war zones, often working closely with U.S. Special Operation Forces and Foreign Intelligence Services. Our third panelist is R. Scott Spielmeyer, class of '90, who is managing director at Tracker Capital Management. He retired from the CIA with nearly 30 years of government service. As a paramilitary operations officer, he served in multiple senior assignments. Prior to joining the CIA, Scott served 8 years in the United States Army, including assignments with the 75th Ranger Regiment, including service in Mogadishu. Our final panelist is Colonel Justin Sapp, class of '94. He is currently the Chief of Staff for the United States Military Staff Committee at the United Nations in New York. His previous assignment was in the office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence, where he served as Chief of the Sensitive Special Operations Division. Prior to joining the Undersecretary of Defense's office, Colonel Sapp held a variety of command and staff positions with the Interagency, the Joint Force, and the Army Special Forces. Ladies and gentlemen, let's give them an initial round of applause. So gentlemen, thank you very much for coming to share your story today. It's one that is very timely, even though it's set back at the start of the global war of terrorism. But since we just left Afghanistan, maybe we should go back to the beginning and how that started, and that'll give us some perspective. So really, I want to start out today by asking you, Toby, how did you, as an author, become interested in this particular subject, and how did you round up all of these panelists and get their story out?
Thank you. Well, that wasn't easy. So it's an honor to be here at BMI. And yeah, so for me, it goes right back to the beginning, to 9/11. I mean, everybody remembers where they were that day, and I'm no different. I was in Washington, D.C., going into the office, Daily Telegraph, and the nation changed, and my life, like so many others, changed as well that day, and that sense never left me, and that's the sort of underpinning of this story and why I wanted to tell it. I mean, I remember vividly Mike Spann, CIA paramilitary officer, former Marine Corps officer, being killed on November 25th, 2001, and writing about that from Washington, D.C., the funeral, Shannon Spann, also a CIA officer, delivering a beautiful eulogy to Mike, and wondering about this great American and who he was and what had taken him to the fort that day. The news agenda moved on. It was anthrax, Iraq, everything else, but it never sort of left me. And probably about 3 years later, I was in Iraq, and another reporter said to me, "Did you ever see that video of the CIA officer who was with Mike Spann, running through the fort?" And I hadn't seen it. I looked at it on YouTube, and that was David Tyson. And it was footage shot by ARD TV, German TV, and there was a shot of him running across what I later found out was the northern half of Kalajanki Fortress, clutching a Kalashnikov in one hand and a Browning high-power pistol in the other, in sort of amalgam of Afghan, Uzbek, and American gear, and then sort of burst into a room and suddenly he's on TV camera almost stuck in his face, and he's being asked questions by a German reporter. And I remember looking at David's eyes in that video, and it was the classic sort of 1,000-yard stare, and just thinking, what has that person been through? He's just seen his comrade killed. He's just killed, probably dozens of Al-Qaeda fighters. He's in, a world of kind of psychological pain, but he has to deal with this unfolding situation, and he doesn't know what the next few minutes or hours are going to entail. And so that never left me, and in around 2013, I decided to try and find David. He was still serving in the CIA, so it wasn't particularly easy, but there was an academic in Indiana University that had cited him in book acknowledgements, and so I emailed the professor who contacted David, who called me. And so we met up in 2013, but he couldn't talk very much because he was still serving in the agency. But I had this sense that there was an incredible American and sort of global story to be told there, and that on some level David wanted to share it, although the big caveat all along, certainly then, was he didn't want it to be his story, he wanted it to be the story of Team Alpha, and more broadly the CIA and what the country did. So for various reasons it got put to one side at that point, but in 2019 it was the 20th anniversary of 9/11 was sort of on the horizon. It also seemed like it was the end of our involvement. And so it seemed to me to be the sort of perfect time, as you said, to go back to the beginning. And I was keenly, aware at this point that we'd essentially won, or these guys had won the war in Afghanistan in 2001 in a matter of weeks. It was a provisional victory, and I'm not suggesting it was going to be easy. Then there was embarked on, a different mission creep, if you like, different type of war, which, we know subsequently sort of ended up in defeat in the summer of 2021. And so I set about, David, it was coincidental, I'd already got the book contract, and when David emailed me and said, hey, I've just retired, would you like to, meet up if you're still interested? And I certainly was. And so there seemed to be a bit of sort of fate involved in that. But David was very clear, he didn't want it to be all about him. And I also felt that there was a much broader story to tell. So I just did it the old-fashioned way. I went from person to person. I went from David to, I think, Justin, who was, I had contacted in 2013, but we hadn't met up. So we met outside a cafe in, New Jersey, and he just, the story was tumbling out. J.R. Seeger, who was the chief of Team Alpha, was a diary linguist, case officer. He retired. He was writing thrillers. So I met him in Western New York, near Buffalo, and I just did it like that. I guess I did my best to build up trust and confidence that I was a serious person, that I wasn't going to cheapen the story. I was going to do it right. I was going to be accurate. And then, so at a certain point, there were some people still serving. Andy is still serving in the CIA, so he needed permission to talk. So I approached the agency, and with some trepidation, because I thought, well, maybe there'll be some competing project that they prefer. I didn't have a particular in with them, but to my surprise and pleasure, they were very helpful. They didn't open the vaults. I didn't get all the secret cables or anything like that. All my freedom of information requests were denied still, different departments. But they did facilitate interviews, including with Scott, with Andy, with Alex Hernandez, who's the deputy chief, the former sergeant major in Special Forces. And so that's how it unfolded.
So Toby, I think you're telling all the students out here that doing good investigation and research will lead to a good story. I think that's what I'm taking out of your thing. So I want to start with the panelists. I introduced you. That's not really the whole story. So starting with David and working your way towards me, if you'll just give us just a little bit more about who you are and how did you end up on this fascinating Team Alpha that was first in Afghanistan. So David and then Scott.
I grew up in Pennsylvania, a small town, and got out of that small town as soon as I could after high school. And the way to do that back then was join the military. I joined the Army. I was in a private artillery battalion for a couple of years, and got out. Went to college, not knowing what else to do. After the Army, they forced me to take a foreign language, something I had never done before. I started taking Russian. I became obsessed with learning languages. Simple as that. And that started a career of undergraduate school, graduate school, of simply learning foreign languages and cultures. Again, I was fanatical about it. Farsi, Uzbek, Turkmen, Russian. Went back in the Army again as an officer, got out again, and then back to graduate school. And during that process, I was learned about the CIA, something I didn't know anything about, but thanks to my foreign languages and foreign travels, living overseas as a student, I was recruited and started my career in the agency, again as a language culture guy, became a case officer, and started serving overseas in places like Tashkent and Central Asia. Places I had studied and knew these languages, and I took my family with me, and that started this long infancy, and when 9/11 came about, I was already in Uzbekistan, had some experience in Afghanistan prior to 2001, and being at that place and that time and given my languages, I was selected for Team Alpha. Not because of my paramilitary skills, which were very, very minimal at the time, simply because I knew a foreign language that was necessary for the mission.
Scott?
Robert Jimmy Mill. That's what I'm talking about. We're very happy that Dave spent all his time studying languages. That was key. My name is Scott Stoller. I'm good to be back at the Institute. I came to BMI sight unseen to BMI from upstate New York, and spent 4 years here, commissioned infantry, did all the standard schools, served in the 101st 3rd Ranger Battalion, 1st Cav, where I commanded, and then back to the Ranger Regiment, and then from the regiment I joined the outfit, CIA, Director of Operations. I was a Special Activities Center officer, which is code for paramilitary officer, serving both ground and air capacities in a command position. And I spent most of my time overseas in the Middle East or South Asia or Africa, doing special activities, covert action, or traditional case officer duties. I finished up as a chief of station in Afghanistan in 17-18, and then finished up my career as the senior director for intelligence programs at the White House, and transitioned out in 2019 after 30 years. On 9/11, my wife and I were in Krasnodar, Siberia, adopted our son Porter, who's here today with us, he's 21. How did I get on Team Alpha? I was the deputy chief of the ground branch team that was designated as 4 members of us served as the core element to Team Alpha. Thank you.
Justin?
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Justin Sapp, BMI class of '94, Robert Virginia Mill, of course. I'm glad you guys are here, and I see some of my old instructors here who had a lot of influence on me going in the Army and going into Special Forces, etc. So thank you for coming. So how did I end up on the team? A little bit of timing and luck. Like Scott, I matriculated BMI. I was 4 years here. I commissioned armor. Spent a little time in Korea. Back in the day, they had an airborne armor battalion. I was in that for a while. It was very interesting. And then I went to SF selection. I was assigned to 5th Special Forces Group, which is at Fort Campbell, Kentucky. CENTCOM group, a Middle Eastern group, as you probably know. So I did some time in the Middle East for a couple years. Got there in 2000, just early 2000. Did some training exchanges in Central Asia, particularly in Uzbekistan, where I actually met Dave before 9/11. And when 9/11 happened, I was in between my detachment command time and going to my subsequent job, which was somewhat up in the air. In that interval, I went to the Combat Diver Course, the SF dive school. While I was down there, 9/11 happened. So when I came back, I was a little bit in a quandary as to what I was going to do. And I was told on this, I think it was the 20th of September, that I was going to go and join a paramilitary team at the Special Activities Division at the time to infiltrate Afghanistan. And that was about it. And that's how it happened. Had I been in command, had I been in another key staff job, I probably wouldn't have been selected, quite frankly. So, as I said, a little bit of time in the life.
Yeah, so great. As our 2 graduates know, and for the rest, VMI's leadership program tries to develop adaptive leaders and increasingly teach them how to operate in cross-cultural environments. I can't think of a better example than what you all did with that mission statement up there for Team Alpha and the 4 different ethnic warlords you had to deal with. So I'd like to learn a little bit more about that and your experience in cross-cultural leadership in this challenging environment. And so what I'd like to do is we'll just go back on the order. We'll start with you, Justin, and maybe tell us a little bit about the story working with Dostum and others, and then we'll just kind of go down the line and get the rest of yours.
So probably the best way to answer that question is to share a quick anecdote with the Dostum anecdote. So in SF training, we have a culminating event called the Robin Stage, the third or the last phase of the key course. During that time, you're sort of graded on how well you can interact with senior leaders, indigenous senior leaders. That's essentially in a nutshell what the test is about, while commanding a detachment as an officer. I personally found that a very challenging phase, and any event, I passed, but I don't think I did particularly well. I made the grade. When I got to Afghanistan in 2001, we were ushered straight into a meeting with the senior leaders, Dostum, and several other key leaders that were part of the Northern Alliance. And I can tell you, at that point I realized, wow, that was great preparation for training. I had the good fortune, at the time, I was pretty junior, so I was on a chart, so I got to observe things. I got to watch Jared Seeger in action, Dave in action, Scott in action, and really what I saw are people that are absolutely dialed in to understanding exactly who these people are, what their intentions are, what their needs are, and then from that, making an assessment for a way ahead. And you have to care. You actually have to care about those people to understand them. And I want to say that's probably, understanding language, like Dave and JR at the time, I didn't speak any Dari. That's incredibly important, but you genuinely have to care about understanding those other people from, the indigenous folks or whichever country you're working in. You genuinely have to care, and a lot of Americans have a problem with that. And I say these guys did it phenomenally well.
Great. Scott, can your insights, and maybe tell us a little bit about Team Alpha and what they were doing in northern Afghanistan.
Yeah, so, you want the insights first or the travel stuff or the?
Insights first, and
Yeah,
then
sure, okay. Like I said, I inserted, I was part of Team Alpha for the first part of the deployment, then I was shifted off to stand up Team Bravo, which supported another commander. So Dostum was Uzbek, and another commander, Mohammed Atamnoor, was Tajik. And then it was a matter of trying to get all four of these commanders to work together to fight the same enemy. So a couple comments up front. Number one is the agency, the training for the agency coming out of the military, is an 18-month program through multiple training courses where there's a focus on dealing with people, right, in the business of recruiting people to be agents, to be spies. That's a people business, and so a lot of, I think, some of the success, at least I think from my part, came from that training from the agency on how to deal with people. One, two is I had some experience before in the Army. I deployed to Kuwait. In the agency prior to this, I deployed to the Balkans, to Asia, to Africa, and so some experience there. And this is the key point here, is Dave Tyson and J.R. Seeger had deep cultural and language, especially Dave on the language piece, were absolutely critical to the mission. So for all you folks out there that have language ability, and I am not one of them, by my Arabic scores and Spanish. If you have the ability in languages, get after it, because that is the key to success if you're going to be operating overseas. And then actually, probably leave it to Toby to set the scene for, or possibly Dave. I'm happy to cover that, but I know you've done this a bunch of times, so.
Sure. So, yeah, let me set the context of the mission. Also just, again, to go back to 9/11, to me it was fascinating that on 9/11, David was flying from Tashkent to London for a meeting about Stinger missiles, which the agency was trying to recover from the 1980s that had been supplied to the Mujahideen. Justin was underwater at the Special Forces Dive School, and Scott, as you said, was in a courtroom thousands of miles away, adopting his son, and then everybody kind of came together. I also just want to mention at this point, Paul Syverson, class of 93 from BMI, he was at Fort Campbell on 9/11, and he was wounded in action on November 26th, 2001 in Kalajangi Fortress, and sadly was killed in action in Iraq in, I believe, June 2004. So all these lives, you know, coming together in this sort of, eventually in this one place. And what fascinated me with the story of Kalajangi, which was the place where Mike Spann was killed, was that the CIA was there, Green Berets, the Special Boat Service, British Special Forces, 10th Mountain Division, there were AC-130s, F-14s, F-18s, the so-called American Taliban John Walker, in fact, Al-Qaeda member was there. So you have all these different, Abdul Rashid Dostum, the warlord from Central Casting, all converging on this one place. For the mission, on 9/11, Kofa Black was the chairman, the director of the Counterterrorism Center at the CIA, and he was sort of the man of the hour. The agency had a plan for Afghanistan, or at least a concept, because the agency had been operating inside the country for the previous 2 years, missions in and out of the Panjshir Valley, liaising with Ahmed Shah Massoud, who was the Tajik leader of the Northern Alliance, assassinated by Al-Qaeda on September the 9th, 2001. So the agency had a foothold, they had a concept of going after bin Laden and Al-Qaeda using the indigenous resistance, the Northern Alliance, inside Afghanistan. Neither the Clinton administration nor the Bush administration wanted to go for it. Politically, at that point, it wasn't a top priority. But the agency knew, Kofa Black knew, George Tenet, the CIA director, knew that Al-Qaeda was coming not only for Americans, they'd already killed Americans in the East Africa embassy bombings in 1998, on board the USS Cole in 2000, but they were coming for Americans in America. And that's what happened on 9/11. So the CIA stepped up. The Pentagon didn't have a plan, sort of remarkably. There was a sort of a very sort of conventional kind of plan put together by General Tommy Franks that would, you know, take, you know, months to get troops in. But Kofa Black, former Africa Division case officer in the CIA with a sort of storied career and a very sort of theatrical and emphatic manner, which was perfect for the moment with President George W. Bush, but also the country. That it was cutting through the bureaucracy and reasons why you couldn't do things, and getting into Afghanistan, getting the people who had carried out the 9/11 attacks, and denying them safe haven in Afghanistan, and stopping the next attack. And the plan was really very simple, which was very small numbers of Americans. This was all achieved with hundreds of Americans, never mind the 100,000 we later had. Very small numbers of Americans going into Afghanistan. Jawbreaker was the first group, which was a CIA team, but they went into essentially safe territory. I mean, obviously that's a relative term, in the Panjshir Valley. But the first team behind enemy lines into Taliban-controlled territory was Team Alpha, 8 men. They were the pathfinders for an ODA, Operational Detachment Alpha, of 12 Green Berets who came in 3 days later. Subsequent, the so-called alphabet teams, you know, Bravo, Charlie, Delta, etc., the CIA teams came in, and various ODAs, initially in the north of Afghanistan, because that's where the bulk of the Taliban resistance was, but subsequently in southern Afghanistan. And the concept went right back to the SOE, Special Operations Executive, and the OSS, the forerunner, not just of the CIA, but also of the Green Berets, so working by, with, and through indigenous allies. And in this case, I mean, I don't believe there was an American invasion of Afghanistan until perhaps 2002. There wasn't one in 2001. These were American advisors working alongside the indigenous Afghan resistance to expel the foreign invaders who were the Arabs of Al-Qaeda. That was the concept. It was an Afghan
Dave, you want to pick up the story from there?
Sure, yeah.
Once Team Alpha's there, and tell us a little bit about Dostum and how it proceeds to Quality.
Right. Our mission was to link up with this commander here, Abdul Rashid Dostum, become his best friend, and enable him to prosecute the war in our favor and liberate the city of Mazar-i Sharif. The first thing we had to do was bring in weapons and supplies. And that was something that the paramilitary guys knew very well, setting up drop zones, bringing in supplies, weapons and so forth. The thing that we didn't expect and plan for was the horse situation. And when I spoke to Dostum on the phone, he had told me, one of his questions to me was, okay, what are you bringing in with you? Basically, how many battalions, how many aircraft carriers, nuclear bombs, 82nd Airborne or what? And I said, no, we got 8 guys. And he said, oh, that's okay. I just have horses, mules, and donkeys. I had no idea what that meant for us. And I just want to stress that initial shock for me, and I think for most of the other guys on the team, of having to get on these animals every single day for a long period of time, and riding these horses, sometimes at great lengths and great distances, for hours and hours and hours. When somebody like me had been on the pony at the 4-H fair, for 50 cents, that was it. That was my experience, and get on these terrible, terrible beasts that had no anyway, it was just terrible. And that's what I love to talk about, because it harkens back to pain, fear, and suffering that I experienced personally, and I think others would agree. So that was sort of situation number 1 for me, was dealing with these long horse rides, the horses, falling off the horses, being tricked by the Afghans to do various things on the horses, because we were the entertainment for them. Obviously, we're fighting a war, so to speak, but there's also a lot of downtime when you're not really doing anything for them, and they're bored, kind of, and we are the entertainment. And that was just one of the biggest initial things that struck me and caused me a lot of pain and fear and suffering. And the second thing I want to stress is the Afghans themselves. These were people that were just right out of the storybooks, right? No education, been fighting their whole lives, basically, as cavalry, as horse-mounted fighters. They would shoot RPGs off their horses, PK machine guns off horseback, moving towards the enemy, cavalry charging, you name it. And we were part of that, unwillingly part of the cavalry force, and watching these guys do what they did with the augmentation of our awesome force of the U.S. air power, airstrikes and so forth, was just incredible to see how these two sort of Stone Age methods melded with the 21st century stuff. And dealing with these guys as individuals, that was my job, to get to know them, to become friends with them, so to speak, and understand them, and basically try to get them to do what we wanted to do. And at the time, certainly our interests were very, very closely aligned, and they turned out to be extremely reliable partners. The ethnic Uzbeks, the Tajik leader Ata, and so forth, the Hazara leader Mohakek. We had a great situation going for us, especially initially. There were a lot of bumps in the road, so to speak. These guys didn't necessarily like each other. And for example, Scott's job was to make sure his warlord stayed in good relations with our warlord, Dostum, which was not an easy feat, but it was something that we succeeded in doing, thanks to a lot of factors, including the weapons and other things that we were able to supply them that made them happy, made them willing to fight with us. And I stress very, very strongly that these guys were willing to shed their own men's blood, these warlords, for our sake, and they were willing to shed blood of the enemy for us as well. And that's why we succeeded, thanks to these warlords and the mix of what we brought to the table.
So Justin, can you talk a little bit about unconventional warfare in regard to So how did these small teams, your team, and later on Mark new to this operational detachment, how did you clear the area of Taliban?
So, great question. So, just to give you a little broad brush overview of what SF Doctrine at the time preached. So, the idea was that you would go with a so-called pilot team to conduct an assessment of the unconventional warfare area and then come back, brief the ODAs, and the ODAs would infiltrate. That was the doctrine. So, functionally, what we performed in addition to their intelligence duty, I helped prepare the ground for infiltration. The original plan was we were supposed to come back, I think initially, and brief the teams and they would infill. With everything going on and the pressure, and I mean a lot of pressure coming from Donald Rumsfeld, that timeline got compressed into what should have been 2 weeks to about three and a half days. So we went from, hey, having 2 weeks to you have 3 days to get your act together, survey the HLZs, do the link up with the principals, pave the way for the arrival of the ODAs, and then you're going to receive them, 3 days later. And that's, in effect, what happened. When they got on the ground initially, Dostum was in a position that could best be described as a stalemate, and Atta was off on his flank, and the ODAs were there to unlock that impasse and basically give them that decisive advantage to defeat the Taliban and push them north towards Mazar, and so they did. It took a couple days to get the close air support coordinated. There was a lot of work going on behind the scenes by JR, by Scott, by Alex, and everybody to coordinate between the different warlords who Dave highlighted. They didn't necessarily always get along. They were rivals, now they're allies, but there was still kind of this frenemy thing going on. That was incredibly complex. And so we provided the emphasis. We used the strengths that they had. We augmented their weaknesses with air power, and that was decisive in unlocking what became a war movement. Now, in unconventional warfare doctrine, there's like 7 phases. We quickly went through those and went right into what some would describe as a war movement.
Scott, you want to add on to that?
When it comes to deployment, I just want to cover 2 points. I think it would certainly resonate with the former commanders and for those cadets that are here, future commanders. A couple of thoughts on this deployment. This deployment, it's obvious, but it was unique in many ways, and particularly in 2 areas. One is the risk calculus, and the second is the operational authorities. So when it came to risk calculus, it was through the roof. I've never seen it like that, and I've never seen it since. Obviously, this was post 9/11, after nearly 3,000 Americans were murdered. We all knew where America was and where the president was, and it was time to get it on, period. And so when we talk about risk, Dave Tyson calling Dostum on an unsecured Inmarsat phone and getting a grid in the clear, this is where you guys are coming. And then, getting off the aircraft, there was no recce, there was no advanced force, there was no nothing. It was unique, no dedicated medical evacuation, no dedicated intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, no dedicated CAS, close air support, no armor, no helmets.
Yeah.
And so, it was incredibly risky, and but it was one of those things where it was that time where it was like, hey, and this is the point for the cadets especially, is for those of you that go in the military, for those of you that go into national security and civilian side, there will be a time when it's time for you to put up or shut up. And for us, that night prior to insertion, it's put up time. And so your day's coming. The second thing is operational authorities. Again, extremely unique. Agency personnel, and especially chiefs of station, have wide authorities and deep authorities to execute the mission forward. It was very unlike my time in the military. We were repeatedly asking for concurrence or permission to move. So the But in this deployment, it was off the charts. If we asked for it, we got it. We wanted mortars, weapons, ammunition, the military provided it. If we needed, $3 million in cash, it was on the next drop. There was nobody telling us what to do from Washington. We decided on the ground, this is what we're doing, and we executed. It was truly unique. So,
Really, mission-oriented orders and go with it. Kind of initiative. Toby, would you set the stage, because we want to talk about Paula Jangi and how that gets set up, and then Dave, if you'll jump in after that, tell us about the prison.
Go ahead, certainly. Just want to underline what Scott said on the degree of risk. And also, although these were two teams, an 8-person team and a 12-person team, they often operated in groups of 3, 4, sometimes even 2. So it was very rare for the entire team together to be together. In fact, I imagine that photograph of K2 on October 16, 2001 was probably the last time Team Alpha was ever, all 8 of them were together in one place. But certainly, so Mazar-e Sharif fell on November the 10th, 2001. So, weeks after landing south of Mazar-e Sharif. And the war then entered a new phase. So Mazar-e Sharif was the first domino in Afghanistan to fall, and it sort of signaled the beginning of the end for the Taliban. Dominoes kind of went the other way in 2021. But there was this sense that the Taliban was on the run, and in northern Afghanistan, their last stand was going to be in Kunduz, about 100 miles to the east of Mazar-e Sharif. And so that was the kind of the focus of the main effort militarily for both the Taliban and for US forces, with some UK forces in support. But there was a very strong sense from Team Alpha and Team Bravo in the Mazar-e Sharif area that this was still a highly ambiguous situation. A lot of the Taliban had been killed, but a lot of them have just sort of melted away back to their villages. The rivalries that have already been alluded to between Atta the Tajik and Dostum the Uzbek and Moakek the Hazara were starting to sort of come to the fore, because they've been all literally pointing in the same direction in taking Mazar-e Sharif, but now Mazar-e Sharif, control of Mazar-e Sharif politically, and the new Afghanistan was sort of up for grabs, and so everybody was kind of jostling for position. This was very much an Afghan war at this stage, and J.R. Seeger, the Team Alpha chief, was sort of adamant about that. So there were discussions going on between the Northern Alliance allies, these warlords, Dostum, Atta, Co, and the Taliban, about how to negotiate a surrender, how to sort of manage the end of the Taliban regime. And so there were meetings inside Kalajangi, which was this 19th century fort which had been headquarters for the Soviets, for Dostum, and now the Americans controlled, between Mullah Fazl, who was a barbaric Taliban commander who controlled the north and butchered burned, massacred Hazaras and their villages, and Dostum and Atta and Moakek. And the Americans were to one side, so Captain Martinouge, the ODA 595 commander, was there, J.R. Seeger was there, but the negotiations were really fundamentally between Dostum and Fazl. And the idea was that the Taliban forces and some of the Al-Qaeda foreign fighters under their command would surrender, and that many of the Afghans would just be sort of allowed to go home in Afghan tradition. but it was a murky deal. It was a very Afghan kind of deal, and I've spoken to JR about this extensively, and he didn't feel good about it, but it was, the concept was this was an Afghan war, not an American war. So fast forward to November 24th, 2001, and suddenly 400 foreign Al-Qaeda fighters turn up on the eastern edge of Mazar-e-Sharif to surrender. They were supposed to be surrendering 100 miles further to the east in Kunduz. So it was a surprise to everybody. There were no Afghans among them. They were foreigners. John Walker Lynn, the American Taliban, was one of them. Lots of Arabs. David described it as the smorgasbord of Al-Qaeda. Every ethnicity and nationality you could imagine, but all united in their desire for jihad and to fight for Al-Qaeda and kill Americans and defeat the West. So that day, it was a long day. Dostum was, and the Americans were there. CIA, Green Berets were trying to work out what was going on and what to do with these prisoners. And there were American planes, B-52s circling overhead to sort of encourage a little bit of, movement in the negotiations from Al-Qaeda / Taliban. Towards the end of the day, it was agreed they would surrender, and Dostum, in consultation with the Americans, decided that the prisoners, these 400, should go to Kalajangi because there was a relatively secure area there. There was a fortified basement in a building called the Pink House, and you can see it there, just looking at the orientation. So the Pink House is kind of in the center, a little bit to the right of the southern half of the fortress. The other option was the airfield, and there's some evidence that Mullah Fazl expected the prisoners to go to the airfield, but Dostum correctly calculated that that was not secure. It was a very kind of fraught and dangerous situation. Now, as part of this, Afghan kind of rules with the surrender. Part of Afghan tradition with surrenders is sort of honor. Prisoners aren't searched, they don't give up their weapons necessarily. Sometimes they switch sides, sometimes they're allowed to go home. These were not Afghan prisoners. There's also, I think, a degree of fear from the Northern Alliance fighters who were terrified of these Al-Qaeda kind of desperados who, there was this strong sense that none of these guys were ever going to leave Afghanistan. They were going to die there by whatever means sort of possible. So the searches were either cursory or sort of non-existent in some cases with some groups. And so these prisoners were brought in trucks to Kalajangi, and they drove through the center of Mazar-e-Sharif, and it was not the perfect situation. I mean, there's a sense from some of the Green Berets inside the Turkish school, which was the new American base inside Mazar-e-Sharif, that these Al-Qaeda fighters were kind of casing the joint, as they were driven past. They could see this was the American base. So that evening, close to dusk, prisoners were being unloaded. One blows himself up with a grenade, kills himself, wounds a reporter, a number of Afghans, and killed two of Dostum's commanders. One of them, who was an ethnic Uzbek who looked very like Dostum, with the moustache, kind of Asiatic looks. And my belief is that Dostum was the target. So it's very chaotic, and so the Dostum's guys decide, right, we need to get these fighters into the basement and secure. And David and Justin had just arrived just as this grenade was going off, and they remember how sort of amped up the Northern Alliance were and how kind of sketchy a situation it seemed. So these prisoners were in the basement. The next day, David, I'm sure, will now talk about it. But these were the first Al-Qaeda prisoners after 9/11 that the Americans have been able to talk to. And it was clear that many of them were hardcore, almost certainly commanders in there. And it turned out there were many met with bin Laden and had been trained in poisons and toxins at Al-Qaeda camps. And so there was discussion with headquarters, Hank Crumpton, who was the deputy to Cofer Black, who was running the war day to day. And there's an imperative to get in there. David felt this very strongly, Mike Spann felt it very strongly, to get in there and find out who these Al-Qaeda fighters were and what they were up to. It was not the sort of situation either in the United States or certainly not in the kind of hearts and minds of people like David and Mike Spann to just wait another day. It wasn't that kind of environment. They needed to get in there. So on the morning of November 25th, 2001, David Tyson and Mike Spann drove from the Turkish school into Kalajangi and entered the southern compound and walked over towards the Pink House, where there were already a number of Al-Qaeda prisoners who'd been taken out of that cellar and lined up for questioning.
So Dave, why don't you pick up the story from
Sure.
here and tell us
Yeah,
about it.
I just want to jump on what Scott had said and sort of explain it in a different way. One of the things the agency does and is very good at, thanks to its experience, it's always given the shit jobs, so to speak. We don't do Easter Bunny races and stuff like that. The stuff we do is often very, the outcomes are all, we have to make a choice. Which is the least worst outcome? That's what, CIA guys, leaders like Scott have been doing their whole career. And my whole career was, okay, what's the least worst thing that can happen? Because there's nothing good here, usually. And that's what we have to decide. That's what our chief did, JR, on a daily basis. This risk calculus every single day of the deployment. What do? I send 2 guys off, ride off, no commo equipment. When will I see them again? Who knows? All this kind of crazy stuff that in many other normal situations you just don't do. And I would say 25 November was one of those situations where we basically had the orders and the mandate to go in there and do a job. And it perhaps wasn't a great situation, but that's what we were there to do, and we went in and did it. So as Toby set the stage, Mike and I entered this fortress, started to talk to the prisoners, and it was immediately evident to me and to Mike that these guys were the real deal. As Toby said, they had been training in all these, they're admitting this to us, training in certain camps in Afghanistan, knowing the Al-Qaeda bombers, some of the guys that took part in 9/11 and so forth. So that was a big impression on us. Immediately, every single language that I could speak, I was speaking. You name it, there were Al-Qaeda guys from all over the world, every ethnic group, every language, every skin color and so forth. Just an incredible group of guys, so to speak, from an intelligence perspective. And we immediately got down to the business of trying to photograph and talk to each person to get the basic information we could from them, and to see, prioritize these people as to who we need to speak to further, and so on. So that process, when you have 400 people, we had Afghans helping us, our Afghan allies were there as well. They provided the guard force for us as well. But as Toby mentioned, these guys, the Al-Qaeda guys, have brought their own their weapons with them, and over the course of about 2.5 hours, near the end of the process of bringing the prisoners out of one building and putting them into another place, taking their weapons, the uprising began, and that's when sort of hell broke loose, and the shooting started, and it's detailed fairly well in the book what took place. But for me personally, I very quickly went to a place I'd never been before at that time, and and I've never been since. And that was on this automatic pilot of just working, thinking it was just still fascinating to me mentally where I was sort of transformed of making decisions, split-second decisions, watching things take place in slow motion. My hearing's gone, tunnel vision, in this thing of slow motion. I was sort of floating around, moving around, thinking, and just these split seconds were just drawn out into slow motion. And that was the time when I was, using my pistol and then taking Mike's rifle off of his body and using that. And to make a longer story short, I will say that I changed magazines in my pistol 5 times, 75 rounds, five magazines, 15 rounds each. And I can hardly remember doing that now. But I do remember one instance where I was doing this, changing my pistol, firing the pistol, changing the magazine, and these guys are right off, very close to me, shooting them, and saying to myself, remember in training when they told you when you drop your magazine, don't pick it up because you're going to lose that split second, because you don't need that magazine anymore. Just put the next magazine and continue on. And I remember very clearly, in the midst of all this, that split second sort of remembrance of my training that I had 5 years prior. And I was no gun person. I didn't use guns a lot. I didn't have a lot of experience with them. And the only time I'd shot that pistol was 5 years prior. So that kind of thing makes a big impression on me, and I use that as a teaching point when I give this sort of lecture that we're seeing up here on the PowerPoint, is that the muscle memory and the training that I received 5 years prior saved my life that day, among other things as well. But that process continued. I used up all my ammunition. I had taken Mike's rifle off of his body, and after a period of time, I escaped to this northern compound and basically waited for assistance in this state of, confusion, chaos, and that period, that sort of several minutes of being sort of on automatic pilot, sort of on a different plane, so to speak, that had going back to normal, and then that's when fear set in, things like fear. I became very fearful for my life and so forth, and being out there, and then finally escaping from the fort after being told by the quick reaction force that included the British Special Forces fellows, some CIA guys and some special forces, that they couldn't get to me because it was the amount of fire that was being put on us was too great from the Al-Qaeda forces. They had to retreat or move back, and I had to do the same. So I left the fortress and came back. The next 3 days, in the period of the next 3 days, was our main goal was to retrieve Mike's body, and that period was very difficult for me as well. People like Scott especially coaxed me and comforted me and got me back in there to assist with identifying the place where Mike was killed and so forth. But I just want to focus on those moments in that initial period when the enemy's very, very close to you. You're shooting your weapon every second or two, and you're just on automatic pilot. And that is something it's hard to convey what that entailed because I don't understand it myself to this day. But that is something that I'll forever, remember, and that is a very interesting part of the story for me. I'll just simply end by stressing the courage and sacrifice of Mike Spann. Mike had a family. He had an infant son. He had 2 daughters, 2 sort of toddler daughters at the time. And Mike was where he wanted to be. He struggled to get deployed and be part of Team Alpha, and it's his memory and sacrifice that I think is the motivating factor for me to be here today, and I think for the other guys as well. people like, we're a very blessed country to have people like Mike among us. And his memory serves us today, and I hope it serves, you know, a little bit of inspiration for you all, especially the cadets here, because you're going to be part of that legacy of those who came before you, and you have the, you know, the Hall of Valor and everything else here. And it's a very, very powerful thing.
If we could just for a second, just wanted to thank Toby here in front of everyone. He's a man of his word, and that means something. Man or woman of their word to this institution. When he reached out, you know, about an interview, and of course we made sure the agency blessed it. But when the agency gave concurrence, there's a simple question to Toby. I understand your goal here is to honor Mike Spann, so his kids will be proud of their dad. Is that true? And he didn't flinch. He looked at me and he said, "That's true." And we thank you for it.
Just one last word here. We're at time, but I want to offer you one last word before we break.
No, I just say, you know, I salute you going forward in your future, in your military careers, and I think the key for me was 6-7 years after graduating VMI, I was in a situation that we just related, and I think it's important for you to know that your country, and you're not going to be able to anticipate when, but one day your country may ask you to step forward and do something like that, and you don't know when that's going to happen. So you have to be vigilant, do your best to keep your mind and your body straight. Focus on languages, as Scott said, that's incredibly important. That's something we're very weak at in the U.S. military, in my opinion. And just take your job seriously. You guys are the vanguard of the United States. And one day, God willing, you may be called on to do something like this. So I just keep that in mind. You never know.
Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, we're actually at time. Our panelists are going to stick around and sign some books, and I know you have some questions, and I know they'll be happy to answer them individually. So let's give them a great round of applause.